Hi, my name is Rebecca Lucero, and we are going to be talking about codependency today. I hope these slides will give you some definitions and give you a better understanding of what we mean when we talk about codependency. So codependency has usually been described as a behavior of enabling somebody. So let's talk a little bit about enabling behaviors, just so you kind of have an idea of what that actually looks like. So enabling behaviors are going to be behaviors that are going to support the addict member's use of the drugs or the substance or the behaviors, the addictive behaviors. So what that might look like is the enabler often doesn't allow the addict to have consequences for their actions. So this might be parents whose children are addicts and they always get a lawyer, right? The child never has to do time for any of their drug violations. This might be giving somebody money, right, when they go wasted on drugs. There's various ways for someone to enable an addict, but this is kind of what it's going to look like. They also provide a pillow each time the addict falls. So anytime anything happens, this person is going to be the person who doesn't want their child or their spouse to fully suffer the consequences of their actions. And so that's why we kind of use that like pillow analogy. Also, denial is a big component of the enabling behavior. So this person often does not see that the problem is as big as it is, or doesn't want to see, right? Maybe we don't really want to believe that our child is really addicted. They're just experimenting. They're young, versus really being able to say, okay, I really do need to let my child suffer the consequences. This is not just a one-time offense where he got caught doing marijuana. This is a sign of a bigger problem. Okay, so here's a definition of codependency: a learned behavior that can be passed down from one generation to another. It is an emotional and behavioral condition that affects an individual's ability to have a healthy, mutually satisfying relationship. It is also known as relationship addiction because people with codependency often form or maintain relationships that are one-sided, emotionally destructive, and or abusive. So one thing that's interesting is that recently they've been conducting a study to see what happens in the brains of people who are the codependent or the enabling person in the relationship. And they have found some information that has shown that often the way the brain functions in terms of addiction for the addict, when they see like an image of the substance that they use, their substance of choice, those same places in the brain light up when loved ones see a picture of the addict. And so there is some research being done to kind of show in the brain that people are actually become addicted to the addict in terms of how their brain is functioning. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens when we hear more about that research and more about what's actually happening in terms of brain function as far as codependency. So the DSM-5 criteria. So the DSM, if you're not familiar with that, that is a book of diagnoses that goes over all the different disorders that someone might have. So right now we're going to be talking about dependent personality disorder. So this is kind of what your diagnosis would be if you would be considered a codependent. The definition is pervasive and excessive need to be taken care of that leads to submissive and clinging behavior and fears of separation, present in a wide variety of contexts and present by early adulthood and having at least 5 of the following. So this is going to go over the next few slides as we look at this criteria. And if you were to be a therapist or any kind of health professional, you would be looking to see, does this person have at least 5 of these attributes or behaviors? So just bear with me as we go through the different slides and kind of go over some of these. First is has difficulty making everyday decisions without an excessive amount of advice or reassurance for others. Needs others to assume responsibility for most major areas of his or her life. Has difficulty expressing disagreement with others because of fear or loss of support or approval. And just be aware that this does not include realistic fears of retribution. So that's another thing that's kind of important as we talk about these things, right? Like this fear of abandonment or needing all this reassurance. There might be times when we actually do need reassurance in life. There may be times where we should be in fear of abandonment or we should be in fear of retribution. The thing that's unique about someone who's codependent is that this is not a realistic fear, right? This is a constant fear. Someone who is healthy might, feel some fears, but they're going to be thinking about those logically, evaluating the circumstances and saying, do I really need to fear? In a codependent, you're not going to see this, right? They are going to be always in fear, regardless of the circumstance, because now it's become just part of their way of being, right, with all the behaviors that they exhibit. Sometimes they'll have difficulty initiating projects or doing things, right? This is because they don't have self-confidence. They're always looking to somebody else to kind of provide motivation or energy or reassurance. They also might go to excessive lengths to obtain nurturance and support from others. So maybe they'll volunteer doing things that are unpleasant. And I see this a lot in clients. And one of the big problems with this is in their relationships, they'll often do things in hopes that they will, get a connection with somebody else, or they want to support someone else. They're really looking for love. And so sometimes they'll do things that they don't really want to do. And the problem is that sometimes their loved ones won't appreciate what they're doing. And then that can be very harmful to the relationship, because this person has been doing a lot of unpleasant things in order to get support or nurturance, and they don't get that in return. And so then they're very resentful, because they've really put themselves out, because everything they've done has been with this aim to obtain reassurance or a sense of safety, right? That I'm not going to be abandoned. But the problem is that there is no real thing that can alleviate it, because it's not based on circumstances. This is an unrealistic fear of abandonment, of retribution. So as they seek this out by doing things that they're not comfortable with, they often end up feeling very resentful of other people. Also, they'll feel uncomfortable or helpless when they're alone. So they have exaggerated fears of being unable to care for themselves. They're not confident that they can take care of themselves. They're not confident that they can make themselves happy. They're always looking to something else to provide them comfort or safety. Also, they will urgently seek another relationship as the source of care and support when a close relationship ends. So these people will be in relationships very often. They do not know how to be alone. They always look to somebody else to satisfy their needs. Also, they will be unrealistically preoccupied with fears of being left to take care of themselves. So a lot of fear of abandonment, fear that people will leave, that other people won't take care of them. Here's the definition of codependent: a multidimensional physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual condition manifested by any suffering and dysfunction that is associated with or due to focusing on the needs and behaviors of others. It develops from turning the responsibility of our life and happiness over to our false self and to others. It is treatable and recovery is possible. I think it's really important to know that it is treatable and recovery is possible. Often, sometimes people can feel like this is my personality, this is just how I am, and it's really important to help people understand that this often can be the source of unhappiness, but they can change this. This isn't a personality thing. This is a set of learned behaviors, and they can change and grow in ways that will make them happier in their relationships. So let's talk a little bit about the false self. It's a defensive facade, one in which extreme cases could leave its holders lacking spontaneity, feeling dead and empty behind an mere appearance of being real. So often this false sense of self is because they are basically just exhibiting behaviors, right? These people don't really have an awareness of who they are, because they're often always looking to someone else. So there's not a lot of self-reflection. They're often looking at what will make other people happy as a way of making them happy. There isn't a lot of focus on what makes them particularly happy. So there's no focus on the self. So there's this false sense of self as someone who might be really giving, really nurturing, someone who cares a lot. I often find that enablers really see themselves as selfless people. I often find that when clients have codependency issues, they often don't want to exhibit healthy behaviors because they feel selfish. So if they are to care about themselves, that feels very selfish. Often they see their enabling behaviors through a lens of, I'm so giving, I'm so loving, and that is going to help my partner and my family, when in reality that isn't true. So often people that struggle with codependency have a very difficult time changing their behaviors because they don't want to look at themselves. They're very used to focusing on others and what makes them happy, and that's how they learn to make themselves happy. Make everybody else happy, and then I can be happy. And that's a very ineffective way to figure out how to be happy. Also, their learned behaviors are a result from adapting to the dysfunction of addiction in a family. So this is just the way their family worked, right? You work around the addiction, the family, addiction rules the family, addiction has all the power in the family. So we see that often people in these families develop, codependent behaviors because that's how you learn to function in a family with addiction. So these learned behaviors, attitudes, and feelings are going to make life painful and unmanageable. And this makes sense because everything is dependent on other people. And that's really hard because often these people don't have the ability to communicate. If I don't know who I am and I don't know what I like and what I'm comfortable with, then it's really hard to communicate to you what I need. So often everybody in these families is acting based on what they think somebody else needs. And often they get it wrong. And so there's always a lot of resentment in these families. At least what I find in the families that I work with, there's a lot of resentment. And it's because everybody is behaving not based on how they actually feel, and they don't communicate about what they want. Instead, they act based on what they think someone else wants. And it's just really hard to be able to achieve any solutions when we're always assuming something. So this often will affect them not only in their current family, right, their family of origin, the family they grew up in, but they usually carry it into other relationships in the future. So the concept of this disorder was first identified by attaching yourself to a stronger personality. So that may be the case too. So often we'll find somebody maybe who's more opinionated. They'll find somebody who's codependent because they say yes to everything. And so sometimes you'll see that can be true, but often I find that codependent people usually find each other, and they both kind of behave in similar ways with one another. Codependence is the most common of all addictions, so you'll see this basically in everyone in the addict family. The addiction is always looking elsewhere. So whether it's drugs or a person, we are looking to someone else to make us feel whole. And the truth is, like, that's just gonna make us miserable, because if we're relying on other people or something outside of us to make us whole, then we have no control over our happiness or our fulfillment. So learning to be independent in some ways, and at the same time being able to rely on others, is really important, but it needs to be in a healthy way in order for us to realize that we are the people that are in charge of our own fulfillment and happiness, and we can invite others to share in that happiness and fulfillment. Codependent behavior, again, is learned by watching and imitating other family members who are going to display this behavior. So it is a learned behavior. I think this is really important to know. This is not someone's personality. This is something that develops over time as they are part of this type of family dynamic in which we look outside ourselves for fulfillment. Okay, so there's two parts to codependency, right? There's the behavioral and there's the emotional, and both are important to the definition. So often the behaviors can be explained or rationalized, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where I'm doing the selfless thing. I don't want my kid's life to be ruined. If he has to go to jail for this, right, he won't be able to go to college, he won't be able to get a good job. So it's really easy to, rationalize the behaviors of somebody who's codependent. And the behaviors often look selfless, giving, sympathetic. This is how the person rationalizes these. I'm helping this person. I love this person so much. This is why I'm doing it. So a lot of this is part of that addiction to be needed, right? So what happens underneath the surface is that there's an internal battle with codependency, and it's very difficult to kind of conceptualize, but the way I think about it is there's a lot of negative self-talk. And so in this person's head, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of fear of not being good enough. And so often everything that they do in their life is often to prove that they are good enough, that they are worthy of a partner, that they're lovable, and so they are constantly doing things that are selfless or things that would promote them as somebody to be loved, and they don't really focus on themselves at all. So everything they do is to kind of battle this negative self-talk. But nobody but the codependent is going to be participating in this battle of self-talk, right? This is all like internal and what's emotionally going on for this person. So often you'll see that they sacrifice a lot. Martyrdom is also a key trait. So an example that I have is I have a couple that I work with. He's in recovery for addiction, and they went on a trip, and they were deciding what to watch. And he says, "Oh, what about this show?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, that's really good. I've seen that." And he's like, "Do you want to watch it?" She says, "Yes." Well, he starts watching it, and he proceeds to watch several episodes because they're staying in a hotel and they didn't have anywhere to go or anywhere to be. At some point, she becomes very upset about this, right? She doesn't say anything, though, and she goes in the other room and reads a book. And she tells herself, she rationalizes to herself, "Well, that's fine. He can watch that show, but I've already watched it recently, and so I'm going to go read a book and I'm fine." But the thing is, later, something comes up and they start to fight about this. And it turns out she was really hurt that he chose to watch a show that she'd already seen and that he continually watched it. So what happens is often these people will do something where they sacrifice for the other person rather than saying like, that's a great show, but I just watched that. Why don't we watch something that we both haven't seen? Right? This is something that somebody who's healthy and is aware of their own needs and wants would say. They'd say, I love that show. You should really watch that, but like I'd like to watch something that, like I'd be really into that I haven't seen. But instead, she rationalizes a lot of things, right? I'm sacrificing, it's okay, but then later comes back feeling very resentful because she didn't feel connected. She felt in some ways abandoned by her partner because he was not aware or couldn't read that she was really unhappy about this. But how was he going to know because she didn't communicate this? So I see a lot of instances of things like this where you'll see that people get resentful pretty quickly, and often the other person has no clue what just happened because there was nothing in the communication that indicated to them that what they did was inappropriate. So this is something that we see a lot. So codependents are aware that there are negative things in their relationship. So but just because they're aware of them doesn't mean that they think that they're at fault. So I want to be really clear about. They're aware that there's something negative about the relationship, that they can never really be satisfied, but they often fail to see that they are part of that problem because often they see themselves as the good person in the relationship, the person that's always willing to sacrifice, the person who's always really caring and thinking about the other person. So this feels really selfless. This feels like the way a relationship should be because I'm the one who cares so much about this relationship that I'm willing to do anything for it. So it's really hard for them to see that some of the things that they may be doing might be contributing to the negative parts of the relationship. So this is also so deeply ingrained in the codependent that often the person doesn't have any other way of being. Often when I work with clients like this, they have when we talk about doing something like self-exploration or figuring out what they want, they have a really hard time with this. With a couple that I work with, I ask them so one way of kind of getting away from this and becoming more self-aware, I ask them for their date night to each person would switch off and the first person would pick 3 things that they want to do, that they only want to do, right? And they're not thinking about what the other person would want to do. 3 things that they really want to do, and then the other person can pick one. So that way the other person has some choice in what they're going to do, right? We're not going to do something that the person totally hates. They have a choice. But at least that way this person is identifying what they want to do and presenting it to the other person. And sometimes in codependent couples, what I find is they can't do it. They always pick of the 3 date ideas, they will pick maybe 1 that they really want and 2 that they think the other person would at least say yes to. So again, there's this failure to explore the self, a failure to communicate what they really want. They're so eager to please the other person and to have the other person be happy that they have so much difficulty even in just presenting choices. So these are things that I find that are very common. So I hope those examples are helpful in helping you to conceptualize what this actually looks like in a real couple or a real relationship. So oftentimes the codependent wants to change but lacks resources and is unaware of alternatives. And I find that these things are so deeply ingrained that often, even when you provide alternatives, they have a hard time accepting those alternatives and figuring out how those would work with the way that they kind of emotionally experience the world and emotionally experience relationships. So it's a big switch for them to go from focusing on making everybody else feel happy or making sure that there's peace with everyone else to thinking about how, if I'm thinking about my happiness, how could that ever, contribute to happiness for others? That's really difficult for them to make that switch. So they often feel hopeless and trapped because of this, because these behaviors and emotions feel very natural and feel probably almost a part of them because they're so deeply ingrained. So it's really hard to feel like I can change these behaviors because it feels like it's the right thing, the right way of being, but they just can't figure out why they're not getting the responses they want. So this cycle is parallel to addiction, right? You're going to see this in addict families all the time. So often it really functions the same way as addiction in terms of it is a cycle and it does need to be broken and changed. So this need, again, is stronger than a desire to be needed. It is like an addiction, right? All of us have a desire to be needed. That is so normal. That's ingrained in us. We need other people. We want other people. And it is healthy to rely on other people. It is not healthy when we need it in an addicted way, right? Because if we need it in an addicted way, then we can never be satisfied, right? If I need help with something, then when I go to someone and they help me, that need is satisfied and we both feel better. But with codependency, you can satisfy my need one time, but it is constant. And regardless if you satisfy my need, there's always going to be this feeling in me that I still am in need, right? Because it's an addiction. So if we reflect back on when we talked about like the dopamine splash and what happens in the brain and how over time the brain constantly needs to be using just to get a normal level of dopamine because it becomes more and more depleted with drug use, right? You can kind of think of that when we're thinking about codependency, that each time somebody meets their need, it's kind of not the same way in a healthy person's brain, right? In a healthy relationship, when you meet my need, right, I'm good. Like you've met the need and we are good to go. But in this, there's this insatiable need to be needed. And so they need constant reassurance because even when you provide reassurance, it never satisfies that person. So a lot of you might be able to think of somebody who comes to you and asks for advice or asks for help, and often you're like, why do I even give it? They are never satisfied. Nothing ever helps. I don't even know why they talk to me because they're always so miserable before and after they talk to me. So that would kind of be an example of codependence. So the codependent also uses the needs of others to make themselves feel whole. So often I find that these people like to fix people. So sometimes I find that they will find partners who they think are in some ways like worse off than them. So sometimes these people can be pretty like high functioning in terms of like maybe they're really successful at work or they don't have any like problems. They'll find somebody with a past and they really want to like save people. So sometimes I find that that's pretty common with people who are codependent. They will do anything to hold on to a relationship. They do not want to feel abandoned. So they often will stay in pretty bad relationships because if the person leaves, that would feel even worse than the abuse that may be going on now. They also feel really responsible. So that also is going to be a problem in trying to end relationships, right? If I feel overly responsible for things in my life, then if a relationship ends, then it feels like it's my fault. I'm the broken one. Just be aware that they do have this exaggerated sense of responsibility, which can often sometimes keep them in bad situations. So they can be dismissive of people who will try and lessen their burdens. So they kind of act in a way where they spread themselves emotionally thin, and they want that, right? This is part of that sacrifice or martyrdom that we often see. They also focus their efforts on everywhere but themselves. It is really difficult sometimes to give therapy to someone who is codependent because they always want to talk about everybody else. They always want to talk about what's going on with them. They have a really hard time staying on the subject of themselves. So when we talk about trying to change their behaviors, they're often immediately go to talking about the other person, talking about what they do. They have a very difficult time staying in that place where they focus on themselves. So also, anger for the codependent is reserved for the defense of loved ones in difficult situations. So this also goes back to that enabling behavior that they often, will get angry and be helpful defending the loved ones. Also, in the ideal world for a codependent, everyone is going to be behaving as you want them to, and you're going to be strong enough to help, and you're also going to be skilled enough to be needed at the same time. So you can kind of see that this is a pretty unrealistic idea of what the world could be like. So as far as treatment goes, it's important for this person to develop a positive self-esteem, replacing that negative self-talk. So there's different kinds of therapy, different kinds of workbooks. They can use cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, also spiritual empowerment. So there's a lot of resources in terms of what this person can do to develop that positive regard for themselves. There's also different kinds of 12-step groups. Al-Anon's a really popular one that a lot of family members of drug addicts and alcoholics will go to Al-Anon, so that it's a specific group for people who struggle with codependency. Also, these people need to be aware of weaning needy people off their need to help list. So just getting away from dysfunctional relationships, realizing that it's important be aware of their own needs and be nurturing those, right? When they can start focusing on meeting their own needs, then they don't need to be so focused on meeting everybody else's needs. And they'll find that they can share like really healthy and satisfying relationships. And although the treatment is going to be very painful, it's going to be helpful for everybody because really, both people often in these couples that I'm thinking of, like a lot of times it will be like an addict in recovery and then a codependent person. Often they're both miserable because they both keep trying so hard to make the other person happy and they can't because that person doesn't even know who they are or what they want. And if you're not aware and you can't communicate what you need and want, it's going to be really hard to help your partner be there for you because your partner can't read you. And often if you don't have any self-awareness, there isn't really anything to read because there is no consistent way of being, right? It's always changing. It's always changing to make everybody happy. So if they can go through the treatment, they can often have a very satisfying and healthy relationship. Also, it's really important that these people find productive and fulfilling activities that don't involve satisfying people, figuring out what they want. Often, I find that people who are codependent do not have hobbies, do not know what they like. Everything they're trying to do, and they're trying to conform themselves to be what the other person needs or wants. So they have a difficult time identifying things that they just love. They often kind of want to love what everybody else loves as a way of being accepted, avoiding abandonment. So this can be really helpful as they find something that is very fulfilling for themselves. Also, in the end, they need to accept that they're unconditionally loved by their higher power. When they can accept that there is a being that loves them just the way they are, that can be really helpful for them to be able to do that self-exploration rather than always tailoring themselves to be what other people need and want. So I hope this PowerPoint presentation was helpful in identifying some examples of what these things look like and giving you some definitions. Just look through the other videos, the YouTube videos. We have some YouTube videos of Twilight that kind of demonstrates what that also might look in a relationship. So hopefully those will help you to have a greater understanding of what codependency looks like.